Lucky for you guys, I was singing along, but I muted myself.
Oh, good. Thank you. So as you can see, that is Parry's most famous piece, Jerusalem, and it's kind of the unofficial national anthem of England. And people just, as you can see, love to sing along. And it's a very stirring melody, and the words are very patriotic. It talks about dark satanic mills, but we won't go there. Words by William Blake, but the music itself is very stirring, and that's been kind of adapted into an official anthem for England. Now, Parry, he wrote that, but that is really only one of his very large output of music. And tonight, I wanted to talk about his life. This is going to be a little bit more biographical than last week when we talked about Tallis. We're jumping ahead now to the Romantic period, but I wanted to kind of give you more of a background on his life, and we're going to hear a few other musical selections, mainly his choral pieces, because we're talking about the Anglican choral tradition here. So he wrote a lot of music, but tonight we're really just going to focus on the choral stuff. So let me get my notes up. Parry lived from 1848 to 1918. There's a very distinguished portrait of him. Let's see if we can make this a little bit wider. He was born in Bournemouth, the youngest of 6 children of Thomas Gambier Parry and his first wife, Isabella, of Hynham Court in Gloucestershire. And that's the house right there. If you're ever in Gloucestershire, you should go visit it. Here it's quite beautiful. Having inherited enormous wealth from his grandfather, Thomas Parry, a director of the East India Company who died in 1816, Gambier Parry was able to buy a country seat at Hynham Court, a 17th century house near the River Severn and 2 miles west of Gloucester. Looks very nice. He was an eminent collector of works of early Italian art at a time well before it was fashionable or widely known, and was also a painter and designer of some talent. He invented spirit fresco, a process of mural painting appropriate for the damp English climate, which he used in his private chapel at Hynham, as well as Ely Cathedral. Besides his love for painting, he was himself musical, having studied piano and French horn, as well as composition during his education at Eton. So Parry's father, Gambier, painted the ceiling of Ely Cathedral. He did not design it, but the original designer died. And so he picked up the work. But, this is kind of like the Sistine Chapel of England. Look how wonderful the ceiling is. So if you're ever at Ely, which is close to Cambridge, this is his handiwork, Parry's father. He also painted some of the chapels at Gloucester Cathedral and some other religious places. His father staunchly supported the 3 Choirs Festival, both financially and against the threat of their closure between 1874 and 1875 by the puritanical Dean of Worcester. So if you don't know the 3 Choirs Festival, it is the 3 cathedral choirs of Hereford, Worcester, and Gloucester. And they alternate hosting the festival each year at their different cathedrals. And I think it's like the oldest running music festival, I don't know, in the world or in England or something like that. It's a big deal, and it was very much a part of Parry's life, as we'll come to find out, and it still goes very strong today. It's a festival of music in the summer every year, and really a wonderful time to hear a lot of English music. Now, 3 of Gambier Parry's children died in infancy, and Isabella Parry died of consumption, age 32, 12 days after the birth of Hubert. She was buried in the churchyard in Bournemouth, and Hubert was baptized 2 days later. He grew up at Hynum with his surviving siblings, Clinton and Lucy. His father remarried in 1851 and had a further 6 children. Isabella's untimely death was almost certainly affected her children, most obviously the eldest surviving son, Clinton, who was only 7 when she died, and more subtly, Hubert. From January 1856 to the middle of 1858, Hubert attended a preparatory school in Malvern, from where he moved to Twyford Preparatory School in Hampshire. At Twyford, his interest in music was encouraged by the headmaster and by 2 organists, Samuel Sebastian Wesley at Winchester Cathedral and Edward Brind at Hynum Church. You may know the name Samuel Sebastian Wesley because he was a nephew of the founder of the Methodist Church, John and Charles Wesley, and he was a big reformer of Anglican choral music. So he was one of the first musicians during the Victorian era to really bring the standard of church music back to from the doldrums of the time before. And so Wesley was a mentor to Parry when he was at Twyford. From Wesley, he gained an enduring love of Bach's music, which according to the Times, ultimately found expression in his most important literary work, Johann Sebastian Bach, The Story of the Development of a Great Composer. So Parry wrote a book on Bach, which was published in 1909. And you've got to remember that in England, the music of Bach was not revived until Mendelssohn came along. So, Bach, who lived from 1685 to 1750, after he died, his music was really not very well respected or widely performed until Mendelssohn came along and performed the St. Matthew Passion. And that's when his music started to become a little bit more popular. And Wesley was also one of those people that encouraged the music of Bach, and Parry went as far as writing a book on Bach, which still is around today. A lot of used copies you see of this book. Brine gave Parry piano and basic harmony lessons and took him to the Three Choirs Festival in Hereford in 1861. Among the choral works performed at the festival were Mendelssohn's Elijah, Mozart's Requiem, and Handel's Samson and Messiah, 2 oratorios by Handel. Orchestral works included Beethoven's Pastoral, his 6th Symphony, and Mendelssohn's 4th Symphony, the Italian. The experience left a great impression on Parry and effectively marked the beginning of his lifelong association with the festival. And later we're going to see that Vaughan Williams and Howells and Elgar all had great associations with the Three Choirs Festival. Anyone have any questions so far? I know this is a very biographical, but I find it very interesting because I've always known the music of Parry, but didn't know quite his influence and the background of where he kind of developed his musical personality. So we'll continue, and he ends up going to Eton, as most boys of the landed gentry do at that time. Home life was clouded by Clinton, his older brother's disgrace. After a promising start studying history and music, Clinton had been sent down for womanizing, drinking, and indulging in opium. During Parry's first term at Eton, further news came that his sister Lucy had died of consumption, just like his mother did in November. That deeply affected Parry, and this was evident in a journal entry where he confessed a profound sense of loss. Nevertheless, he threw himself into the life of Eton, with energy and distinguished himself at sport as well as music, despite early signs of the heart trouble that was to dog him for the rest of his life. Though Parry never mentioned being under family pressure, his biographer, Jeremy Dibble, speculates that since his interest in music had grown to such a point where it could no longer be ignored or thrown away, the knowledge of his father's opposition to a musical career and having seen how such a denial had contributed to the rebellious nature of his brother's character, the burden of expectation must have seemed enormous. Eton, at that time, was really not noted for their music program like it is today. They have a wonderful music program now for their students. But back then, Parry turned to George Elvey, who was the organist at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. And if you know the geography of Windsor, Eton is just down the road from Windsor Castle. So he could easily travel from Eton to Windsor Castle to have studies with George Elvey. Elvey was musically conservative, preferring Handel, the music of the Baroque, to Mendelssohn, the music of the Romantics. And though Parry initially idolized his teacher, he eventually realized how unadventurous he was musically compared to Samuel Sebastian Wesley. Parry nevertheless benefited from Elvey's tuition and gained the advantage of being able to write anthems for the choir of St. George's Chapel, which under Elvey's direction had reached a standard exceptional in English choral singing of that time. And remember, I said that it was really quite bad around that time. English cathedral choirs were, they were singing 2 services a day, usually morning prayer, matins, and evening prayer, and they hardly ever rehearsed, and it was just not good. And so people like Elvey and Samuel Sebastian Wesley and John Stainer, who was at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, were really the ones to elevate the music at that time. Elvey also started his pupil on contrapuntal disciplines of canon and fugue, which were 2 genres of music that Bach had championed. And so if you do a study of Parry's music, you will see that he is influenced, and he has that kind of old-fashioned style of canon and fugue in some of his pieces. And soon he was able to train for music degree at Oxford. While still at Eton, Parry successfully sat the Oxford Bachelor of Music examination, the youngest person who had ever done so. And so in 1867, Parry left Eton and went to Exeter College in Oxford. He did not study music, being intended by his father for a commercial career, and instead read law and modern history. His musical concerns took second place. However, during one summer holiday, on the advice of Wesley, he went to Stuttgart in Germany to study with a man named Henry Hugh Pearson. As Parry recalled, Pearson's prime aim appeared to be to disabuse me of Bach and Mendelssohn. And so during this time in Germany, there was more fashionable music going on. The music of Weber, Carl Marie Weber, Italian music of Rossini, Beethoven, Schumann, all these great composers that we hear about now were kind of more in vogue on the continent. And so Parry was kind of exposing himself to more of this modern music rather than the music of the classics like Bach, of Handel, and of Mendelssohn. However, the biographer Jeremy Dibble notes, Mendelssohn's influence on Parry's own music persisted. After leaving Oxford, he was an underwriter at Lloyd's of London for 7 years. However, he found the work uncongenial and wholly contrary to his talents and inclinations. But he felt obliged to persevere with it, to satisfy not only his father, but his prospective parents-in-law. In 1872, he married Elizabeth Maud Hubert, second daughter of a politician, and his wife Elizabeth. His in-laws agreed with his father in preferring a conventional career for him, although Parry proved as unsuccessful in insurance as he was successful in music. And he and his wife had two daughters, Dorothea and Gwendolyn, named after George Eliot characters. Parry continued his musical studies alongside his work in insurance. In London, he took lessons from a man named William Bennett, but finding them insufficiently demanding, he sought lessons from the famous Johannes Brahms. However, Brahms was unavailable, and he was recommended to the pianist Edward Dannreuther, wisest and most sympathetic of teachers. And this man gave Parry piano lessons, but soon extended their studies to analysis and composition. At this stage in his musical development, Parry moved away from classical traditions inspired by Mendelssohn, and he was introduced to the music of Wagner, which influenced his compositions during these years. I'll play a short clip in a minute. At the same time, his compositions were coming to public notice. Parry was also taken up as a musical scholar by George Grove. And George Grove was the assistant editor for a new dictionary of music and musicians. And nowadays, the Grove Dictionary of Music is kind of the gold standard of music dictionaries. It's like 20-something volumes. And Parry wrote 123 articles to contribute to that. So he was really important and quite a good scholar when it came to music history. In 1883, Grove, as the first director of the new Royal College of Music, appointed him as the college's professor of composition and musical history. And he would take that position and have that for I think most of his life. Parry scored a success with the ode Blessed Pair of Sirens, which is a piece that our choir has sung before, probably about 5 years ago. It's a great work with words by John Milton, and it's about, I forget, 8 or 10 minutes long. It's a big piece that you can't really do on a Sunday morning. It was commissioned and dedicated to Stanford, who was one of the first musicians to recognize Parry's talent. Stanford described Parry as the greatest English composer since Purcell. And who is the greatest English composer after? Most people say Benjamin Britten. Okay, now at this point, let's, why don't we play a piece of music that you will all recognize. This is I Was Glad, and this was written by Parry for the coronation of, who was it? Edward? One of the Edwards. It was not written for the coronation of Elizabeth, but it was played at her coronation because it's been played at every subsequent coronation. And this is a wonderful, grand work that was written when the monarch enters Westminster Abbey and walks down. This version does have a middle section that is reserved only for coronations where the Queen scholars yell out, long live the Queen. So I hope you will enjoy I Was Glad. I think it's worth listening to the whole thing. It's about 5 or 6 minutes long, so you can sit back and relax. This is from St. Paul's Cathedral in 2002 when the Queen celebrated her Golden Jubilee. So her 50th anniversary as Queen, they reenacted I Was Glad from St. Paul's. All right. I was
Wow.
glad by Hubert Parry. Now, that's not a text that's new to coronations. Actually, Henry Purcell wrote a setting of those words from the Psalms for the coronations back in the 1700s. But Parry updated it with this kind of more romantic idiom. If we look at the structure of that piece that we just heard, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Very grand. And then there's that middle section. If you kind of heard them saying, Vivat Regina Elizabetha, long live Queen Elizabeth, they were almost yelling, Vivat, Vivat, Vivat. And in those big buildings, the echo kind of makes that even more dramatic. And then there's this really beautiful lyrical middle section, Oh, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. So that is taken right from the Psalms, and you can hear a contrast. It's not bombastic, it's not vivacious, it's really lyrical and more heartfelt. And it gradually builds in intensity until the very end. Peace within thy palaces. And that's kind of the big musical structure of the piece. But you can see why it's so popular and so well loved, and it's been sung at, I don't know, 4 coronations since it was written, because it just fits the occasion so wonderfully. But that was Parry. That's his contribution to coronation music, but also now it's like every choir wants to sing that piece because it's just so fun to sing. Okay, now going back to my little presentation, we're not almost there. Let's see, close this out first. There's Parry on a cigarette trading card. You know how we have baseball cards? Well, they used to have famous musicians and famous politicians on trading cards. And so there's Parry. He made it. Peak years. Now well established as a composer and scholar, Parry received many commissions. Among them were choral works such as the cantata Ode to St. Cecilia's Day, the oratorios Judith and Job, and the psalm setting De Profundis. You may not have heard of any of these works, but you may know the hymn Reptin, or Long Dear Lord and Father of Mankind in our hymnal. Well, that is actually music from the oratorio Judith. So, Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, that's by Parry. And it was originally contained in this oratorio that he wrote in 1888. Contemporary critics generally regarded Parry's orchestral music as of secondary importance in his output. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, many of Parry's orchestral music pieces have been revived. And if you listen to WHRO, they play a lot of English romantic music probably because it sounds good on the radio. It's not too loud, it's not too soft, it has kind of beautiful melodies. So you will hear a lot of Parry's orchestral music, but he's generally known for his choral music. When Grove retired as director of the Royal College of Music, Parry succeeded him from 1895 and held the post until his death. And in 1900, he succeeded John Stainer as Heather Professor, which is a kind of endowed professorship. When he was a professor there, he taught the famous Ralph Vaughan Williams and rated him highly as a composer and teacher. He also taught people like Gustav Holst, Frank Bridge, and John Ireland, music that we perform music from all of these composers. Now, despite the demands of his academic posts, Parry's personal beliefs, which were Darwinian and humanist, led him to compose a series of 6 ethical cantatas, experimental works in which he hoped to supersede the traditional oratorio, and cantata forms. They were generally unsuccessful with the public.
Excuse me, Kevin.
Sure.
Are those ethical cantatas available? Were any of them recorded?
They probably
know?
are recorded by someone out there.
Mhm.
You could probably find a recording of it, but they're not very well known. They're not mainstream pieces that choirs are lining up to sing. But
Mhm.
you may be able to find the Prague Radio Symphony Orchestra recording of it. Just because they got a contract from the record company to do. Oh, we haven't recorded these pieces by Parry, so can you do it? Kind of
Okay.
thing. But I had never heard of them before. So they're probably, not very good. Parry resigned his Oxford appointment on medical advice, and in the last decade of his life produced some of his best known works, including a symphonic fantasia, Ode to the Nativity, and the Songs of Farewell. The piece by which he is best known, the setting of William Blake's poem And Did Those Feet in Ancient Times, which is what we just heard at the beginning of this seminar, was immediately taken up by the suffragist movement, in which both Parry and his wife were strongly in sympathy. Parry held German music and its traditions to be the pinnacle of music and was a friend of German culture in general. He was accordingly certain that Britain and Germany would never go to war against each other, and was in despair when World War I broke out. In the words of the Oxford Dictionary, it writes, during the war, he watched a life's work of progress and education being wiped away as the male population, particularly the new fertile generation of composing talent of the Royal College, dwindled. In the autumn of 1918, Parry contracted the Spanish flu pandemic and died that year. So he was 70 years old, and the death certificate says the cause of death was number 1, influenza, and number 2, septicemia, which isn't that what we heard on Downton Abbey was the disease that killed someone, septicemia? I just kind of remember that. At the urging of Stanford, he was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, where we just watched the video of I Was Glad. And there is a memorial tablet with an inscription by the poet laureate Robert Bridges in Gloucester Cathedral, which was unveiled during the Three Choirs Festival of 1922. And here is the picture from Gloucester Cathedral. This memorial is in the back of the church, and it has an inscription by Robert Bridges in there. And so that's kind of that's his life. That's Parry. I hope it wasn't too detailed, but I thought it was really interesting, kind of where he came about. And I wanted to play one last piece for you, and this is one of his songs of farewell. He wrote these, I think there's 7 or 8 of them at the end of his life, and they're all a cappella pieces, and they kind of gradually grow in complexity and length. And this is one of the more simpler ones. Let me see if I can pull it up. This one is called My Soul, There Is a Country. And the text is by Henry Vaughan. And this one's only a few minutes long. It's about 3 minutes long, but you can see it's for a cappella chorus. And so see if you can listen to some of the stylistic differences. Remember, I Was Glad was written early on, bombastic. This one I think is a little bit more intimate. It has some of those techniques like counterpoint and canon that we associate with the music of Bach. And I think Parry kind of wonderfully encapsulates all of that into about 3 minutes worth of music. My soul,
Catch the live news, sports, and shows you.
Oh, darn, that ruined it. Sorry. That's YouTube advertising. I'm sorry. It was like 20 seconds from the end. But anyways, that's a wonderful piece. You can see there's a lot of moods, all a cappella, but different moods. It's almost like a little symphony in miniature. And I think it's one of Parry's greatest pieces. And so I encourage you to, do your own research and kind of listening to Parry. If you just type Hubert Parry into YouTube, you'll find a lot of stuff. Listen to his orchestral music. He wrote chamber music. We know him for his choral music. And look in the hymnal. There's music by Parry in there too. Does anybody have any questions or stories about Parry or anything you want to share? Yep, Margaret?
No stories, but I think it would be great if after COVID, we could do a whole Parry concert. That would just be lovely.
Yeah, well, or even sing I Was Glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. I mean, I think the words are so fitting.
Right.
But yes, Parry is one of those, kind of feel good composers. They're really kind of, it's fun to sing, fun to listen to, and, a great for our space too. It kind of matches the architecture of our church.
Yeah. He sure had a rough life.
Yeah, he did. And he was really profoundly affected by the war. And he lost a lot of colleagues as well. So that whole generation of English composers, of, just anyone living during that time was really not easy. And you can kind of see it reflected in some of his music, as we're going to learn about in 2 weeks' time. Next week is Ralph Vaughan Williams, and then Herbert Howells. Herbert Howells was also deeply affected by the war and the going-ons of that era. All right, thank you. Well, thank you for being a very captive audience, and I hope you learned something. And again, I encourage you to, listen on your own. And if you have any questions in the future, just let me know. But next week, we will be talking about Ralph Vaughan Williams, not Ralph, Ralph.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
Like Ralph Fiennes.
For all
Yeah.
these years, I did not know how to pronounce his first name.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Kevin.
have a good week. Take care.